So I'm going to tell you a few things about literature. My focus will be contemporary British fiction, and I decided to write and talk about two quite recent British novels. Time permitting, I'll tell you about both, but I think I'll manage to lecture only on one, to talk about only one. One is Jim Crace's The Pesthouse, this is 2006, and the other is Will Self's The Book of Dave, it's 2007. What I want to say in that presentation, the bottom line of my argument, is that biblical scriptural myths, I'll explain that difference, slash in between, in due time. So what I want to say is that biblical myths do survive, are attractive, but they exist, they function in contemporary British literature in a diluted, transformed and very often surprising forms. And I decided to label that form, those myths, adopt weak myth. Okay? I'll explain what it means in a moment. I'm starting with some concepts of myths that I find inspiring, I find stimulating. One is Robert Segal's, if you could go through that quotation and decide for yourself, it's very general, and it's meant to be very general. That definition is not interested in the content of myth or in its truth status, but it is interested in the viability of myth. Myth is a story about something, and that something is left very vague on purpose. This is a story which accomplishes something, again, significant for adherents. So this is something that I found stimulating. And the other thing I wanted to tell you about, to signal, is that for quite many literary critics or people writing about myth in literature, there is a certain duality in myth. That myth is not, a monolith, but there are some, dimensions in myth. And as you can see, I'm drawing here on Paul Ricoeur, on Leszek Kołakowski, a Polish philosopher, and on Lawrence Cooper, a guy who deals with various sorts of myths. What's the gist, right, of what brings those three guys together? They claim that in myths, there is, on the one hand, something that tends towards structurization, stabilization, preservation, conservation, identity making, and on the other hand, in myth, there is something like the impetus towards change, this breaking of barriers, going beyond limits, and depending on who is telling us about this duality, the terms, the labels for those two aspects are different. In Ricoeur, this is utopia versus ideology, versus perhaps is a bit exaggerated. For Ricoeur, myth is social imagination, and it has those two dimensions. One supports the other. So there is not so much a tension, but mutual support or mutual correction. Utopia stands for this permanent possibility of something new coming. And ideology is that identity making, stabilizing. Both are needed, provided you know the balance and provided you know how to make, as he put it, a spiral rather than a vicious circle. In Kołakowski now, with Kołakowski I have a sort of terminological problem because he refuses to define, to give labels. But I'll single one metaphor to tell you how he imagines that stabilizing aspect, and he uses the metaphor of tumor, of cancer. Myth can grow cancerous, it can be like a tumor infecting the whole organism, society, having imperial aspirations. And on the other hand, he says that myth is what we need to function in a hostile, indifferent world. It's our way of coming to terms with indifference in cosmos, let's say. And Couper, Lawrence Couper, who again has his own terms, I won't go into too many details, he distinguishes between allegory and radical typology. Allegory is that aspect of myth, that dimension of myth, which believes that behind the narrative, behind the mythical story, there is some logos, some essence to be unveiled and shown, recognized. On the other hand, this radical typology is historicized. It is it possesses that the dimension of possibility and change. Okay. Now, moving on to biblical scriptural. Biblical is a sort of narrower term, because one of those novels I'm discussing, Bible is only one of holy writs. There is also the Book of Mormon and the Quran. So I use that perhaps clumsy term to signal that it is biblical, but it might be considered wider as well. So now what I would like to focus on is not only that flexibility of myth that I mentioned, this element of change that I told you about a minute ago, but also I want to have a list, perhaps that list is too long, of how the Bible is seen as persevering, surviving, still having its liveliness, but in surprising ways. Not only, as a theological text or as the basis of our religious life, but also in other ways. So it persists, but in transformed forms. I want to start with a respectable literary critic, Northrop Frye, and his idea of what happens with myth. Myth for him is not a literary genre, but by this logic of displacement that you have listed here, it survives, it is integrated, or it informs all the rest of literature, as it were. This logic of displacement is, as he puts it, the adaptation of myth to canons of morality and plausibility. It's the credible context, and myth, with its belief in God's authority, God created and made us silent, or expects us to accept simply that, is in literature contrasted with the idea of man made it, man created. And in all literary genres, he starts with the myth and romance, high mimetic, low mimetic, ironic modes, that mythical undercurrent is there in this changed, displaced form, but it's there. My next example is Deborah Sugar, a critic who, she wrote a book on the Renaissance Bible, and what she finds out is that contrary to what we might expect, the Bible in the Renaissance was not only exercising this centrifugal pull, that is, it's not only being scattered over a variety of new disciplines which need new vocabulary and ideas, but it also functions as the field, the space where tensions, contradictions, frictions within those disciplines can be negotiated or articulated. So the Bible is, in a way, providing a place for some disintegration, or something on the verge of disintegration, or something not yet integrated. Right? My next example is Sheehan and his Enlightenment Bible. I tried to make it sort of historical, moving on through from the Renaissance to the Enlightenment. He writes about post-theological Bible, the Bible that does not have anymore this one unified center of theological authority, but it still is viable. It's extremely attractive, and it comes to define, to inform variety of disciplines: pedagogy, history, morality, poetics, especially in England. So these are those scattered, centers of authority. The Bible is there, though in a different form. My next example is Schneider. He is a biblical critic, and what he writes about the Bible, I find it very striking, and I think more traditionally minded people will have problems with accepting that. The West inherits its ability to self-scrutiny, self-questioning, abandoning previous positions and working out something new because they inherited from the Bible. The Bible itself is mythoclastic in relation to itself. It can undo its own myths, which are, necessarily there, which are sort of about to come to surface, and it concerns both nature and culture. Now, something which I take to be the most provocative idea here, this is Hugh Piper, a guy who started as a biologist and then moved to biblical department, and he grafts those biological ideas onto biblical studies. He is inspired by Dawkins and his idea of meme. Meme is like gene. It's the smallest cultural unit that gets recycled, replicated, remembered in culture. And the Bible, for Hugh Piper, is that immensely versatile mimetic pool. It is so versatile that it can cater for the needs of somebody who is against slavery and pro-slavery, against homosexualism and and who accepts homosexuality. So, irrespective of whether the Bible is criticized or accepted, it survives because it is this active replicator influencing the minds of reader, making them rely their survival on the Bible's survival. Now we have Yvonne Sugar. Very briefly, contemporary critics, contemporary writers seem to be in two minds about the Bible. They don't accept of it, but they can't get detached. So what they do is to get into the Bible and criticize the Bible by means of the Bible, by means of its stories and myths. And now, something I only want to treat in a very offhand, perhaps, way. I want to signal that I'm aware that what the background of what I'm telling you about is the problem of secularization. I treat it as a problem. Let me say, again, in a metaphorical way, religion and the Bible is not like a cream floating on the surface of milk in a pail that you can just skim, and there you have milk without that fatty substance. The Bible and religion permeate the whole of culture. So what happens in secularization is not elimination, loss, or leaving behind, but rather translation, worldling, transformation. Okay. Now, these are those two novels I wanted to talk about, and I explained that thing in the title, the terminology. I adopted, and I know it's risky, I adopted a term, weak myth, to describe what happens with this transformed biblical narrative in contemporary fiction. And if you hear the echo of Gianni Vattimo, you are right. I am greatly... Yeah, exactly. I'm greatly indebted to Vattimo here. You have the terms that I'm making use of. This is weak thought, weak overcoming, and piety. I won't discuss this, but I'll tell you how I understand this weak myth of mine, and most of those things I'm going to tell you about are related to those concepts. So weak myth stays in touch with the past. It does not overcome the past in a strong sense, like, okay, we close the door, that's it. We don't want to have the Bible anymore as a local, anachronistic, messy book. We are faddish, we are modern, we are beyond that. The weak myth stays attached, makes use of the past, accepting its very often fragmentary, distorted form, making the most of it, approaching it with charity, with loving affection, understanding its limits, understanding that the myth can, has that dangerous streak that it can get imperial, cancerous, allegorical, or ideological. I'm using the terms from the first slide. So weak myth, as if knows that. I think it's self-conscious type of myth, and it shows in literature how self-conscious that myth can be. And it understands its own historical dimension, its own contingency, its likelihood to change, to be replaced with something else, to transform into something else. Right. Now, Jim Crace and the Pesthouse. I wonder if you know the novel. Anyone who? Right. I skipped a lot of what I wanted to tell you about. I planned to tell you about dystopia, but well, I have only 4 minutes to finish. So, perhaps we can return to it later. Both Jim Crace and Will Self are dystopian novels. We have in the Pesthouse a vision of dystopian America in a distant future. This is the country with no technology whatsoever. I mean, handmade things are there, but nothing made in factories. People cannot read the script of contemporary times. They don't know letters, they don't write. They hunt, they tend to their fields. That's for the starters, right? That's where we are. And from the very start, the novel insinuates, because it's not done in this open fashion. Look, it's the promised land, myth, and, well, there are some other myths as well, but it creeps in slowly by means of various metaphors, by means of various turns of phrases or images scattered over the novel. So we have that America as the promised land, or America that used to be the promised land, but is no longer the promised land. What I mean by America as the promised land, when the Puritans, the first settlers started from England, they imagined themselves as the elect nation. They were the new Israelites, chosen by God and traveling to their new chosen land. If you think that this kind of discourse is dead, you are wrong. Madeleine Albright was talking about the last best hope. America is the last best hope for human race, and Ronald Reagan was talking about the anointed land. So that sort of word choice is still there. But America in the novel is no longer that land, the promised land. Well, most of people living there head east towards the ships which are meant to take them to the promised land, which is, guess where? In Europe, probably in Europe. So everyone rushes, risking life, and 50% never make it to the east coast. But the promised land is elsewhere. What I want to say is that the promised land in the novel does not become simply congealed, stabilized, or finished as if a closed chapter. It still energizes those people. But the way it energizes them is troubling, is dystopian. Dystopia is this dream gone wrong, dream becoming a nightmare. And what we have in this dystopia is that energy, the impetus, the permanent possibility, is here as if perverted. What I notice is that they reverse. My first word choice was rewind. They rewind the old myth while the settlers traveled from the east to the west, and they treated America as their promised land. Now that myth is reversed, and significantly, on the east shore, those American people are supposed to forget, erase America. It is, well, my reading, my interpretation is that the future here, in that case, future simply lies in the past, that what was lost on the way can be found and enjoyed in its untainted, unmodified shape. They simply return to what they started, as you rewind the film and you are back there, as if nothing happened in between. And more importantly, may I go on? Yeah? Yes. Yeah, may I finish that? What we have, the name that Crace attributes to that myth of the promised land is a fever. Contagious diseases are important in the novel, so it's not, an isolated element in the novel. It makes kind of a huge network in the novel. And the myth of the promised land, that desire to go to the land of opportunities, which is elsewhere, not in America, is called fever, burning them up and driving them on. I think it is significant that there is something sick about that energy, that it's not entirely healthy, and one more remark, taking into consideration what happens on the way when people return to the East, and I signal here violence, and it's extreme violence, rapes, murders, they murder for nothing, for those meager possessions that those people have. Robbery and enslaving people, we have greed. All of that is animated, energized by the myth. There is this fairy town, and fairy town is, as the very name indicates, there is a passage over a very turbulent river. Those people make money on the promised land myth. They charge a lot for those pilgrims who come, stay the night, and buy meals. But because there are quite many people returning, going to the east, seeing what's there. I tell you what's there in a moment. Returning with their relatives in bags, or badly wounded, or simply abandoned and helpless. They stand on the bank of the river, waving and begging for mercy, but the fairy town people never accept them back, because that would be bad publicity, right? Those who have just arrived would see how you look when you return from the anchorage, and that would discourage the pilgrims, and that would put an end to that big machinery here. This disintegration, what I mean specifically, is what happens on near the ships. I wanted to say one more thing. I have the feeling that Crace not only as if criticizes or has bitter comments on what is going on with in America right now, but he also, in a very tacit way, criticizes the myth, the biblical myth, where this violence incubated. I mean, Israelites moving on to the Canaan and being licensed to get the land, which means killing, which means destroying cities. The Canaan, when they entered, was well developed. People lived in cities. Israelites was, a horde of, not rustlers, but people, semi-nomads, right, we can say. So I think there is this hidden criticism there as well, not only of present situation, however we can describe that, but also of the Bible. And this is characteristic of what happens whenever a British novelist returns to the Bible. There is always asking perhaps too much of such a narrative. Disintegration. People arrive at the shore, and what they see is, a fleet, strange-looking guys, bearded guys, a set of... I have to finish.